Millions saw it live. Jair Bolsonaro leaned toward the microphone, narrowed his eyes at Zohran Mamdani, and said the words that would echo far beyond those walls. "Sit down, boy." Gasps rippled through the audience. You could hear people's voices break in shock, like the sound of air leaving a balloon. The silence that followed was almost violent. Thousands of people packed into the Phoenix Convention Center sat frozen, waiting for what would happen next. On the front row, a pastor from Detroit shook his head slowly, his lips pressed tight. 2 rows behind him, a young college student in a navy hoodie muttered, "Did he just say that?" as his phone shot into the air to start recording. CNN's cameras didn't miss a beat. Neither did Fox News. Every outlet had their lens trained on the stage, ready to capture history, though no one knew they were about to get something bigger than politics. Bolsonaro sat back in his chair, almost satisfied. His supporters in the audience laughed nervously, unsure if clapping was the right move. Some smirked, some looked away. But on the other side of the room, people were visibly shaking with anger. A woman in her late 60s clutched her pearls like she was trying to steady her heartbeat. The contrast in the room was undeniable, half in shock, half in hesitation. And then there was Mamdani. He didn't lunge forward. He didn't slam his hand on the table. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. Instead, he leaned back slightly, placed one hand on his lap, and with the other straightened his jacket. That small, deliberate gesture carried more weight than 1,000 words. It told the audience he was in control. It told them he wouldn't be dragged into a shouting match. For a few long seconds, Mamdani said nothing, and that silence grew heavier with each passing moment. Some in the crowd began whispering, filling the void. Is he going to respond? Did he hear it? What's he waiting for? Up in the press gallery, reporters fumbled with their laptops, trying to put together sentences for tweets that hadn't even finished happening yet. Even the moderator, Professor Harold Stokes from Arizona State University, shifted in his chair nervously, his eyes darting between the 2 men like he was watching a train collide in slow motion. The camera zoomed in closer. You could see the tension in the lines of Bolsonaro's face. You could see the calm calculation in Mamdani's, and you could feel the weight of the moment settling into the air like a storm that no one could stop. Bolsonaro, sensing the silence wasn't working in his favor, leaned toward his microphone again. "What did I say? Something wrong?" he asked, smirking. His tone was sharp, almost taunting, as if daring Mamdani to take the bait. But Mamdani didn't flinch. He pressed his lips together in a faint half-smile, tilted his head slightly, and simply stared at Bolsonaro. The crowd erupted in nervous murmurs. It was the kind of stare people give when they have already decided that words will matter more than volume. In that instant, everyone knew something was coming. The calm before the storm was almost unbearable. Even a Fox News analyst sitting at the edge of the press row leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "If he speaks, this whole thing changes." Every eye in the room was locked on Mamdani, and even Bolsonaro, tapping his fingers against the desk impatiently, couldn't escape it. The weight of expectation thickened until the room itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. What came next wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a counterattack. It wasn't rage. It was something entirely different, something sharper, stronger, and impossible to ignore. But before Mamdani opened his mouth, the silence itself was already telling a story that America wouldn't soon forget. For nearly 10 seconds, the silence held the entire Phoenix Convention Center hostage. It was the kind of silence that makes your throat dry and your palms itch. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, as if the very air between the stage and the audience had thickened. Nobody wanted to miss the next move. Mamdani didn't rush. He reached for the glass of water at his side, lifted it carefully, and took a slow sip. The sound of the microphone catching the ice shifting in the glass was strangely loud. When he set it back down, his movements were steady, intentional, almost ceremonial. That calmness unsettled Bolsonaro more than if Mamdani had shouted. The president shifted in his chair, tapping his fingers louder against the desk, this time glancing out at the crowd, as if to remind them he was still in charge. "Why isn't he saying anything?" whispered someone in the front row. Their voice cracked with both anxiety and hope. A woman beside them replied, "Because silence is louder right now." Every second Mamdani stayed quiet was a second Bolsonaro lost control of the stage. Reporters in the gallery stopped typing altogether, their fingers frozen above the keys, waiting for that first word. Cameramen leaned closer to their lenses. A boy in the audience, no older than 12, tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "What did he mean by boy?" The father, eyes still locked on Mamdani, muttered, "You'll understand when you're older." Bolsonaro couldn't stand it any longer. He leaned forward again, his voice dripping with irritation. "What? No response? I thought you had something to say." His laugh was sharp but didn't land the way he hoped. It scattered awkwardly in the air, bouncing off walls that weren't on his side anymore. Finally, Mamdani shifted in his seat. He placed both hands on the table, leaned slightly toward the microphone, and looked at Bolsonaro, not with anger, but with something sharper, a kind of patience that cuts deeper than rage. "I'll respond," Mamdani said softly. His words were simple, almost quiet, but the crowd reacted like a spark had been lit. Phones shot up higher. Reporters snapped back into action. The silence broke, but only slightly, because everyone wanted to hear every syllable that followed. But Mamdani didn't rush. He sat back again, giving the room a chance to breathe. The weight of anticipation grew heavier. He let Bolsonaro stew in it, and that restraint itself was a message. Mamdani was not going to be dragged into Bolsonaro's pace. He's about to take him down, Zohran Mamdani thought. His supporters nodded slowly, not daring to blink. The moderator, Professor Harold Stokes, tried to interject, "Gentlemen, if we can," but stopped himself. He knew this wasn't his moment to control. The country was watching something raw, something unscripted, and his job was to let it breathe. Mamdani glanced briefly toward the moderator, then back at Bolsonaro. He adjusted his tie, not nervously, but like a man setting the stage on his own terms. Every small movement seemed to stretch time, commanding attention in a way words hadn't yet. "You know," Mamdani finally began, "I've been called a lot of things in my life." He paused, letting the words settle. "But respect has never been something I had to beg for." The crowd roared. The eruption of applause filled the hall like thunder. People shot to their feet, some clapping until their palms turned red. A black pastor in the front row raised his hand high and shouted, "Amen!" Bolsonaro smirked, rolled his eyes, and mouthed something under his breath, but the cameras caught it. "Give me a break." Mamdani didn't let the noise linger too long. He raised his hand slightly, and the crowd gradually quieted, still buzzing with energy, still waiting. His silence had been more than a pause. It was strategy. And now the words he was about to string together carried more weight because of it. Bolsonaro leaned back, arms crossed, clearly irritated. He tried to cut in, but Mamdani didn't look at him. He looked at the audience instead, like they were the ones he'd come to speak with all along. And in that moment, it became clear this wasn't about answering Bolsonaro anymore. It was about something bigger, something deeper that touched everyone watching at home. Before Mamdani's full response came, that silence had already shifted the power in the room, and everyone knew the stage belonged to him now. The moment finally arrived. Mamdani leaned toward the microphone and the hall went silent again. Not out of shock, but out of sheer anticipation. You could almost feel the audience's heartbeats sink as one, waiting for the first words to leave his mouth. Mamdani began, his voice steady, carrying a softness that made the words hit harder. "You see, respect is never handed out like a trophy. It's not tied to the office you hold or how loud you can speak. Respect is earned by the way you treat people, earned by the example you set when no one is looking, and most of all, earned by the way you listen." The crowd clapped hard, the applause rolled through the room. Bolsonaro shifted in his chair, his jaw working as if he wanted to interrupt, but the sound drowned him out. Mamdani didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned back slightly, letting the applause run its course before continuing in that same calm, deliberate tone. "Mr. President," he said, turning his gaze back to Bolsonaro, "I've been called many things in my life. Some of them by people who didn't know me, some by those who didn't want to. But I'll tell you what I learned a long time ago. When people resort to insults, it says more about their fear than it does about your worth." A sharp murmur rolled through the crowd. A man in the balcony leaned forward and muttered, "He's cutting him," without even raising his voice. Bolsonaro huffed, snatched his microphone, and snapped back. Don't lecture me about respect, Zoran. I'm the president of Brazil. His words were forceful but shaky, like he was trying to grab hold of a room that had already slipped out of his grasp. Mamdani didn't flinch. He let Bolsonaro's words hang in the air, then calmly replied, "Yes, you are. And that's exactly why every word you speak carries weight. The title doesn't make you bigger than the people you serve. The title should remind you that your job is to carry yourself in a way worthy of their trust." That line detonated applause, whistles, even a few people stomping their feet. The moderator looked out across the hall, his hands raised in a half-hearted attempt to calm the audience. But even he couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Mamdani leaned in again. You can demand someone sit down. You can try to shrink them with words. But the truth is, respect doesn't bow to commands. Respect comes when you stand for something greater than yourself. A middle-aged woman in the second row, wearing a bright red blazer, stood to her feet and shouted, "Say that again!" The crowd roared in agreement. Mamdani gave a small smile, then continued. We teach our children that the measure of a man or a woman is not how much power they can grab, but how they use the power they've been given. We tell them to be fair, to be honest, to lift people up, not tear them down. Those lessons aren't complicated, they're simple, and yet they mean everything when you're trusted to lead a nation. Bolsonaro leaned forward, cutting in again. Oh, please, you think lectures make you great? People didn't elect me to give sermons. They elected me to fight. Mamdani turned to face him directly, this time his eyes calm but piercing. You're right, they didn't elect you to give sermons, but they did elect you to lead, and there's a difference. Fighting for yourself isn't leadership. Fighting for people who don't look like you, who don't pray like you, who don't agree with you, that's leadership. The hall exploded again. Even a few Bolsonaro supporters who had come to show support for him were clapping, caught in the momentum of Mamdani's words. Cameras zoomed in on faces. A young Latina student from Tucson, wiping away a tear, an older white veteran clapping slowly with both hands, his eyes never leaving the stage. And yet, Mamdani wasn't finished. He leaned closer to his microphone and added, almost in a whisper, "You see, Mr. President, the most powerful thing a leader can say is not sit down. It's stand up with me. That's the difference." The ovation that followed shook the walls. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting. The sound rolled like a wave across the hall, spilling into every corner. Bolsonaro threw his hands up in frustration, muttering, "Oh, give me a break." But his voice was swallowed by the applause. He leaned back in his chair, visibly irritated, as Mamdani calmly folded his hands on the desk and let the moment speak for itself. But as powerful as that reply was, the real story was just beginning. The reaction outside those walls would turn this moment into something even bigger. The ovation didn't die down quickly, it rolled in waves. One section of the hall clapped until another picked it up again, like an echo that refused to fade. The Phoenix Convention Center was no longer just a venue for a forum. It felt like a battleground where words were weapons, and the crowd itself was caught in the fire. On the left side of the stage, a group of young activists from Sao Paulo jumped to their feet chanting, "Stand up with me," repeating Mamdani's closing line as if it were already a rallying cry. Their voices bounced off the high ceilings and gained momentum as others joined in. But not everyone was clapping. In the back rows, a cluster of Bolsonaro supporters waved their MAGA hats defiantly. One of them, a man with a salt and pepper beard, wearing a shirt that read "Build the Wall," yelled over the cheers, "Sit down, Mamdani. You had your time." His voice was swallowed quickly by the crowd, but it highlighted the fracture cutting through the room. Reporters scribbled frantically, each one knowing their story angle depended on where they stood in the divide. A journalist from the Arizona Republic whispered to her colleague, "This isn't just a forum anymore. This is going to shape headlines for weeks." Down front, Reverend Harold Gaines from Detroit, who had flown in with his congregation, pressed his hand against his chest and shook his head. Tears glistened in his eyes as he whispered to the woman beside him, "That's the kind of dignity they can't strip from us. That's history speaking." Meanwhile, 2 rows back, a Republican governor from Nebraska leaned forward, his face tight but thoughtful. He whispered to his aide, "He's making sense, and that scares me." The aide scribbled notes quickly, knowing the governor's reaction could affect how he'd need to frame his next press conference. The divide wasn't just in the crowd, it was in the body language of the stage itself. Bolsonaro leaned back, arms crossed, his face set in a stubborn frown. He tapped his fingers against the desk louder now, the microphone picking up the rhythm of irritation. Beside him, Mamdani's hands were still folded, his eyes scanning the audience like a teacher making sure the lesson had landed. The moderator tried once more to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's please keep the discussion civil." His voice cracked, the plea almost drowned by the competing voices of cheers and shouts. But the crowd wasn't calming down. A college student from Arizona State raised his voice, shouting toward the stage, "Respect isn't about power, it's about character." His words triggered another ripple of applause from the other side. A Bolsonaro supporter yelled back, "We don't need lectures, we need fighters." The two voices clashed in the air, symbolic of the broader divide, splitting Brazil right in front of the cameras. Fox News' cameraman zoomed in on a young black girl in the audience holding her mother's hand tightly. Her eyes were wide, her expressions somewhere between fear and awe. The image captured in that exact moment would later flood social media feeds across the nation. CNN, on the other hand, kept its cameras locked on Mamdani's calm face, the perfect counterpoint to Bolsonaro's visible frustration. Both networks were already crafting two different Brazils for their viewers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," the moderator tried again, but his words were swallowed whole. By now, the forum was less about questions and more about raw emotions spilling out of people who felt like they were witnessing something bigger than politics. Bolsonaro leaned into his microphone, snapping, "This isn't supposed to be a pep rally for Mamdani. I'm the president here, not him." His voice boomed, but instead of applause, it drew a chorus of boos from parts of the audience. Mamdani didn't respond right away. He simply turned his head slowly toward Bolsonaro, giving him that same measured look he'd carried since the beginning. The crowd interpreted it as strength, and once again, applause filled the silence. Near the exits, security guards stiffened, prepared for anything. The tension was thick, not violent, but charged, like a stadium split between two rival teams. And yet, as the shouting and applause swelled, one truth became clear. The room wasn't united under one man. It was torn between two visions of what leadership meant. For some, it was force, command, and domination. For others, it was patience, dignity, and restraint. What made it more powerful was that the cameras caught all of it. The anger, the applause, the tears, the frustration. Millions of Brazilians watching at home weren't just hearing words. They were watching a mirror of the country itself, divided and loud but unable to look away. But the real storm wasn't in that room. It was already forming outside, where the media and social networks were preparing to carry this clash across every screen in Brazil. By the time the forum ended, the São Paulo night sky was glowing with camera lights and satellite trucks. Reporters crowded outside the convention center, like vultures circling fresh prey. Microphones, cameras, and smartphones were thrust into the air, each one trying to catch the first reaction from attendees spilling onto the sidewalks. CNN's Jake Tapper stood just steps from the main doors, already live on air. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we witnessed tonight wasn't just a political clash, it was a cultural earthquake. The president's words and President Mamdani's response are already dominating every platform you can imagine." Fox News was set up across the street. Their host, Laura Ingraham, standing under bright lights with the convention center glowing behind her, said, "This is being blown out of proportion." She turned to the camera. President Bolsonaro was simply speaking directly, as he always does. The left is trying to turn it into something racial. Meanwhile, MSNBC's Rachel Maddow leaned into her desk, shaking her head as clips played on the big screen behind her. "You cannot ignore the weight of those words. Sit down, boy." That was not a slip. That was not an accident. And Mamdani's response, calm, steady, dignified, only underscored the difference between the two men. Inside Twitter's São Paulo headquarters, moderators were scrambling. The hashtag #SitDownBoy had already hit the top of the trending list in Brazil and was racing toward the #1 global spot. Just beneath it, another tag was gaining speed. Stand up with me, the exact phrase Mamdani had delivered on stage. Clips of the exchange spread like wildfire. One video taken by a college student in the balcony captured the audience's gasp in crystal clear sound. Within an hour, it had racked up 3 million views on TikTok. Another clip, posted by CNN's official account, showed Mamdani leaning into the microphone and delivering his line about respect. It had been retweeted over 200,000 times in less than 30 minutes. And then came the memes. Screenshots of Bolsonaro's crossed arms and sour expression were plastered with captions like, "When the teacher calls you out in front of the whole class." Others paired Mamdani's calm stare with lines like, "Leadership doesn't yell, it teaches." The frenzy wasn't just online. Across the country, evening news anchors were reshuffling their lineups to lead with the story from Sao Paulo. Local station 12 News cut away from a segment about a monsoon storm to replay the confrontation. In Brasilia, WBZ News opened its 11 p.m. broadcast with the clip, their anchor's voice measured but tinged with disbelief. "Tonight, a moment in Sao Paulo that has the entire country talking." That was a masterclass in leadership. Not all reactions were jokes, though. On Facebook, pastors, teachers, and community leaders were writing long posts about what the moment meant. Reverend Lisa Harmon from Indianapolis wrote, "Mamdani reminded us that the strength of a leader is not in tearing others down, but in showing restraint. That's what our children need to see." Her post was shared more than 40,000 times in a single night. Meanwhile, conservative commentators fired back on Breitbart's homepage. A headline screamed, "Mamdani plays victim again. Mainstream media cheers." Fox's Sean Hannity told his viewers, "The left is trying to crown Mamdani a saint while ignoring the real issues at hand. The president is a fighter, and fighters don't mince words." Still, the footage was unavoidable. Whether you watched CNN, scrolled Instagram, or tuned into your local ABC affiliate, the same clip played again and again. Bolsonaro saying, "Sit down, boy." Mamdani pausing, adjusting his jacket, and replying with words that carried more sting than any insult. At 1 a.m. Eastern, Twitter's trending bar looked like a battlefield. At our "sit down, boy," #Mamdani response, and #respect is earned were all trending. Presidential Forum analysts estimated that more than 50 million people had already seen the clip within the first few hours. By morning, headlines stretched across front pages. The Washington Post, "Respect versus power, Mamdani silences Bolsonaro with words." The Wall Street Journal, "Forum sparks political firestorm as Mamdani-Bolsonaro clash." Even the Los Angeles Times simply ran the quote as its headline. "Sit down, boy." The moment wasn't staying in Sao Paulo. It was crawling into every living room, every phone, every conversation in the country. The story had already slipped free of the politicians on stage. It now belonged to the people. But the real question was what this would mean behind closed doors. Because while the public was glued to their screens, both Mamdani and Bolsonaro were retreating to private rooms where the fallout was just beginning to take shape. Inside the White House residence that night, the mood was volatile. Bolsonaro paced the length of the carpet in the Lincoln sitting room, his tie loosened and his face flushed. The TV was still on, tuned to Fox News, where Laura Ingraham was attempting to defend his remarks, but even her tone carried a hint of strain. Bolsonaro jabbed his finger toward the screen. "They're twisting it, twisting everything," he barked, glancing at his advisors gathered around him. "I didn't mean it the way they're saying. It's the fake news again, blowing this up. I just told him to sit down." Jason Wilkes, one of his senior aides, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. President, with respect, the clip is everywhere. Social media isn't letting this one go. Even some of our allies are struggling to spin it." Bolsonaro turned on him like a whip. "Struggling? That's your job. Fix it. Get Hannity. Get Al Tucker. I want every outlet reminding people that Mamdani was the worst leader in history. The economy, the jobs, the disasters. Remind them." He slapped his palm against the arm of a chair. "They can't give him the win on this." Across the country, in a quiet hotel suite in downtown Chicago, Mamdani sat with a few of his closest friends and former staffers. The TV was muted, though the scrolling captions still replayed his response line by line. Valerie Jarrett leaned forward on the sofa, her voice low. Barack, that was something else. You didn't just answer him. You showed the contrast without raising your voice. Mamdani rubbed the bridge of his nose and let out a slow breath. I didn't go there tonight to spar. I went to talk about leadership, about where we're headed as a country, but he made it about respect, and that's fine because maybe that's what people needed to see. David Plouffe, seated near the window, tapped his phone. The reaction is huge, trending globally, hashtags all over. You've got young people repeating your line like it's a mantra. Stand up with me. I haven't seen this kind of organic energy since Yes, We Can. Mamdani chuckled softly but shook his head. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm not running for anything. But if the message sticks, if people talk about dignity and respect in their daily lives, then maybe it's worth the firestorm. His wife, Michelle, who had stayed mostly quiet during the conversation, finally spoke. Barack, it wasn't just about the message. It was about the way you handled yourself. You didn't let him drag you down. Kids are watching this. Families are watching this. They need to see that composure matters. That's the lesson. Back in Brasilia, the phones were buzzing. Calls from Republican senators poured into the White House switchboard. Some were offering public lines of support, but privately warning Bolsonaro to soften his tone. Senator Alan Briggs from Sao Paulo had been blunt. Mr. President, that phrase won't play well in the suburbs. You've got to walk it back or it'll haunt you. Bolsonaro scoffed at the suggestion. Walk it back? Never. That's weakness. People elected me because I don't apologize. I doubled down. He grabbed a pen and scrolled something on a notepad. Draft me a tweet. We're not playing defense. We hit back harder. Meanwhile, in Mamdani's suite, the discussion turned to what came next. Jarrett scrolled through her phone, reading aloud reactions from community leaders across the country. Pastor Williams in Rio de Janeiro said, "He's using your words in Sunday's sermon." A teacher in Salvador posted that she played the clip for her students. Even some conservative voices online were saying, "You handled it with class." Mamdani leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. This isn't about me. It's about the kind of behavior we normalize. If a president can speak like that without consequence, what message does it send? Not just to adults, but to children who will think that's how leaders act. Michelle nodded firmly. That's why tonight mattered. Not because of politics, but because it drew a line. Respect isn't optional, it's essential. Even as Mamdani reflected quietly, Bolsonaro's world was already spinning. Strategies were being drawn up. By 2 a.m., tweets from his official account began firing off. Fake news twisting my words. Mamdani's weak reply won't fix the disaster he left behind. Within minutes, his supporters were retweeting it thousands of times. But for every loyalist echoing his defense, there were 10 voices replaying Mamdani's calm words, sharing the clip with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like behind closed doors." The contrast was stark. Bolsonaro's team was scrambling, panicked but aggressive, determined to control the narrative. Mamdani's circle remained calm but purposeful. They understood they didn't have to chase the story. The story was chasing them. But the real measure of the clash wouldn't come from politicians or advisors. It would come from ordinary Brazilians waking up to headlines and deciding for themselves which version of leadership they wanted to believe in. Those who usually kept politics at arm's length were suddenly debating leadership, dignity, and respect like their lives depended on it. In a small diner off Interstate 71 in Columbus, Ohio, the television above the counter replayed the clip on a loop. Truckers and factory workers hunched over steaming mugs of coffee, their faces glued to the screen. One man in a faded camouflage jacket muttered, "That was cold." He didn't even have to raise his voice. A waitress wiping down the counter chimed in, "My kids watched it this morning before school. They said Mamdani looked like a teacher scolding the class." And they're right, he did it without yelling. In Dallas, a high school teacher wheeled a television into her classroom and pressed play. Her students watched silently as Mamdani's calm response rolled across the screen. When the video ended, one student, a quiet boy in the back, raised his hand. Why did he call him boy? My grandpa used to say that word was never just about being young. The teacher took a deep breath. That's exactly the conversation we need to have. Words matter. A leader's words matter most of all. Meanwhile, in Sao Paulo, Reverend Harold Gaines, who had attended the forum himself, spoke from his pulpit that Sunday. His congregation leaned forward as he quoted Mamdani's line, "Respect doesn't bow to commands." The crowd clapped, some rising to their feet as Gaines thundered, "Dignity is not granted by office. It is shown by character." His sermon went viral after a church volunteer uploaded it to Facebook. By that evening, it had over 2 million views. In rural Montana, a retired farmer named Clyde was interviewed outside a hardware store by a local news crew. Wearing a worn John Deere cap, he shrugged. "I didn't vote for Mamdani, never did, but I'll say this, he carried himself better than I've seen in a long time." The other guy looked rattled. His honesty struck a chord online, especially with independents who often felt alienated from partisan shouting matches. College campuses buzzed with energy. At the University of Michigan, students organized an impromptu rally on the quad, holding signs that read, "Stand up with me." Videos of students chanting the phrase, many of whom weren't even old enough to vote when Mamdani was in office, spread across TikTok. "This isn't about politics," one student shouted into a bullhorn. "It's about how leaders treat people. That's the standard we should all demand." Not every reaction was favorable to Mamdani, though. In Alabama, a local radio host told his listeners, "The media is painting Mamdani as a saint, but let's not forget, he's not the president. Bolsonaro is, and Bolsonaro doesn't back down." Calls poured into the station, some in support, some angry, but every single caller had watched the clip. Even in workplaces far removed from politics, the moment was the talk of the day. In a steel plant in Gary, Indiana, a group of workers debated during their lunch break. One man, his hands blackened with soot, shook his head. "I don't care who you vote for. If my boss talked to me the way Bolsonaro talked to him, I'd quit on the spot." Another worker shot back, "But that's Bolsonaro. He's a fighter. People like that." The break room filled with laughter, frustration, and spirited back and forth, proving just how deeply the clash had burrowed into everyday life. On social media, stories from ordinary Americans poured out. A single mother in Albuquerque tweeted, "My 12-year-old daughter asked me why the president called Mamdani boy. I had to explain a history she shouldn't have to carry. Thank you, Mamdani, for showing her strength. Looks like calm." Her post was retweeted tens of thousands of times. In Miami, an elderly Cuban-American man was interviewed outside his apartment complex by Univision, switching between Spanish and English. Mamdani showed what real leadership is. Calm dignity. That's what I want for my grandchildren. His words resonated with viewers tired of constant chaos in politics. The divide wasn't neat or predictable. Some conservatives admitted respect for Mamdani's composure, while some liberals fumed more at Bolsonaro's language than they celebrated Mamdani's restraint. But the common thread was clear. The country was talking about words, talking about respect, talking about what leadership should look like. By Monday morning, polls showed something startling. A Snap survey from Reuters found that 62% of Americans, including 35% of Bolsonaro supporters, believed Mamdani had handled himself with more dignity than Bolsonaro during the forum. The numbers rattled Brasilia, sending both sides scrambling to read the public mood. While everyday Brazilians were giving their verdict at kitchen tables and factory floors, lawmakers in Brasilia were already sharpening their responses, knowing the political fallout would reach the halls of Congress within hours. By the time Monday morning rolled around, Brasilia was already in overdrive. Cable news chyrons blared with phrases like forum fallout and respect versus power. Pundits lined up in studios to argue, but the real heat was brewing on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers from both parties were cornered by reporters as they arrived at the Capitol. Microphones shoved in their faces. Each one was asked the same question. "What did you think of the president's remark?" Senator Caroline Haskins of Sao Paulo didn't mince words. Standing on the steps of the Russell Building, she said firmly, "That comment was unacceptable. Full stop." It demeaned not only Mamdani, but millions of Brazilians who saw themselves in that moment. Leadership is about lifting people up, not tearing them down. Her clip was replayed endlessly. Her tone was calm but biting. On the other side of the aisle, Senator Rick Dalworth of Bahia offered a different take. "The president speaks directly, and sometimes that ruffles feathers. But I think the media is inflating this beyond reason. Let's focus on the policies, not the personalities. Still, even as he spoke, his eyes darted nervously to the crowd of cameras. He knew the clip was powerful enough to stick. In the House, younger members were the loudest. Representative Aaliyah Brooks from Minas Gerais tweeted, "Respect is not optional." Every child watching that forum learned more from Mamdani's restraint than from Bolsonaro's outburst. We must demand better. Her post hit 1 million likes in less than a day. Meanwhile, Republicans in vulnerable districts scrambled. Congressman Paul McKenna of Pernambuco released a carefully worded statement. "I don't agree with the phrasing used, but I continue to support the president's overall leadership." It was a tightrope act, a desperate attempt to please both sides. But local papers mocked it as spineless. Behind closed doors, GOP strategists were panicking. A leaked memo from the Brazilian National Party warned candidates to avoid repeating or defending Bolsonaro's exact phrasing and pivot to the economy, security, or criticism of Mamdani where possible. The memo itself leaked to Politico, sparking another news cycle. Democrats, on the other hand, smelled opportunity. House Speaker Linda Navarro held a press conference on the Capitol steps, flanked by civil rights leaders. This moment goes beyond politics. It's about what kind of example we set for our children. President Mamdani showed grace. President Bolsonaro showed disrespect. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Her words framed the clash not as a partisan spat, but as a moral test. Cable news only fanned the flames. CNN replayed Mamdani's line about respect. The title doesn't make you bigger than the people you serve. On an endless loop, calling it the quote of the decade. Fox countered by bringing on guests to insist Bolsonaro was simply asserting authority. MSNBC invited historians who compared Mamdani's composure to moments from past leaders like Lincoln and Kennedy. But perhaps the most striking moment came when a group of Republican senators, long known for standing firmly behind Bolsonaro, broke ranks ever so slightly. Senator Jonathan Keene of Arizona told reporters, "Words matter. We all know the history of that word, and it shouldn't have been used. We can back the president on policy, but we should also be honest about mistakes." It was the closest thing to open criticism yet, and it sent shockwaves through the conservative base across the country. Advocacy groups jumped into action. The NAACP released a statement praising Mamdani's measured and powerful response, while calling on Bolsonaro to apologize. Civil rights attorneys appeared on morning shows, explaining why the word boy carried such a painful legacy in Brazil. Evangelical leaders were split. Some defended Bolsonaro's bluntness, while others, like Reverend Thomas Ellery in Tennessee, told his congregation, "Leadership without respect is not leadership at all." In the midst of this, the White House communications team scrambled to rewrite the narrative. Press Secretary Dana Hollis faced a barrage of questions at the daily briefing. "The president uses plain language," she said, her tone clipped. "It wasn't meant in the way some are spinning it. Let's not get distracted by sound bites." But as reporters shouted follow-ups, the briefing spiraled into chaos. Meanwhile, Mamdani kept quiet. He released no official statement, gave no interviews, and didn't take to Twitter. His silence became its own story. NBC's Chuck Todd put it bluntly, "The more Mamdani says nothing, the louder his response from that stage becomes." By Tuesday, late-night comedians were still milking the moment, but lawmakers were taking it dead seriously. Committees began referencing the clash in hearings. One congresswoman even quoted Mamdani's line in a speech on the House floor. The ripple wasn't just cultural, it was legislative, seeping into the very fabric of Brazilia's daily grind. But as Brasilia fought over spin and headlines, the impact was spreading even deeper into schools, churches, and homes, where the moral weight of Mamdani's words was shaping the way ordinary people thought about leadership and respect. The story no longer belonged to politicians or pundits. By midweek, it was clear that Mamdani's words had slipped into the bloodstream of the country itself, reaching classrooms, churches, barbershops, and living rooms, where politics usually felt distant. What had started as a heated exchange on stage was now being translated into lessons, sermons, and conversations about dignity that stretched far beyond Brasilia. At Jefferson High School in Sao Paulo, just miles from where the forum took place, A social studies teacher opened her class by projecting the video onto a whiteboard. Her students, some of whom had family members who attended the forum, sat in rapt silence as the clip played. When Mamdani said, "Respect isn't demanded by a title, it's earned through conduct," one student scribbled it into the margins of his notebook. The teacher paused the video and said, "That right there is why words matter. That's leadership without shouting, without insults, just truth." In a small church in Recife, Reverend Miriam Tate stood before her congregation the following Sunday. She raised her Bible in one hand and her phone in the other. The screen paused on a clip of Mamdani speaking. "Brothers and sisters," she said, her voice echoing through the sanctuary, "when a man refuses to lower himself to anger, but instead calls us to rise higher, that's a lesson worth remembering. Respect doesn't bow to commands. It lives in how we carry ourselves." Her words sparked a standing ovation from parishioners, many of whom had never cheered inside that sanctuary before. Meanwhile, in Sacramento, California, a group of middle school students turned the phrase "Stand up with me" into a banner they hung across their cafeteria wall. Their principal, caught off guard, admitted to a local reporter, "I've never seen kids take a political moment and make it their own like this. They weren't even alive when Mamdani was first elected, but they get it." Photos of the banner spread online, praised as proof that the moment was already shaping the next generation. Even workplaces took notice. In a hospital in São Luís, a supervisor began a staff meeting by quoting Mamdani's line about leadership. "Fighting for people who don't look like you, that's leadership." Nurses and doctors nodded in agreement, some exchanging glances that said more than words could. For a brief moment, the chaos of the hospital floor gave way to reflection. In rural Bahia, a farmer interviewed on NPR put it more simply. "I'm not much for politics," he said, his voice steady. But when Mamdani said respect is earned, that hit home. Out here, you treat your neighbors right, or you won't have neighbors for long. That's just life. His plain-spoken reflection was replayed across social media as a reminder that the message was bigger than party lines. For younger generations, the clip wasn't just a political spectacle. It was content on TikTok. Teens spliced Mamdani's words over motivational videos set to background music, ranging from gospel choirs to rap beats. One video, showing a montage of student athletes training, paired with Mamdani's line, "Respect comes when you stand for something greater than yourself," gained over 10 million views in 2 days. The most striking proof of the bigger picture came from the countless family conversations happening across dinner tables. In Milwaukee, a mother told a reporter that her 9-year-old son had asked her during dinner, "Why was the president so mean to Mr. Mamdani?" She admitted she struggled with how to explain the weight of the word boy without overwhelming him. But then she showed him Mamdani's response and said, "That's what strength looks like. Calm, patient, firm." Not everyone saw it that way, of course. Conservative talk radio hosts railed against the hero worship of Mamdani, insisting the media had overblown the moment. One host in Oklahoma sneered, "If rolling your eyes and giving a lecture is leadership, then every teacher in Brazil is the next president." But even their mockery revealed the reach of the moment, because they couldn't stop talking about it either. The divide was clear, but so was the fact that the story had grown bigger than politics. Teachers were quoting Mamdani in classrooms, pastors were weaving his words into sermons, and parents were using his response to teach lessons about dignity and leadership. It became a lesson in dignity, and young people were turning it into art. The message had stretched into corners where politics rarely mattered, and it was sticking. But as the cultural wave grew stronger, the real lesson would have to be distilled, because this moment wasn't just about one forum or one clash. It was about defining what leadership should mean for generations to come. By the end of that week, the noise had not quieted. Clips still rolled on television, hashtags still lit up screens, and commentators still dissected the moment like it was a turning point in history. But beyond the chatter, something deeper had settled. People weren't just replaying what Bolsonaro had said or what Mamdani had answered. They were wrestling with the meaning of it. In Springfield, Missouri, a father sat with his teenage daughter at the kitchen table. She had just finished watching the clip again on her phone. "Dad," she asked, Why didn't Mamdani yell back? If someone said that to you, wouldn't you be mad? He thought for a moment, then replied, "Sure, I'd be mad, but that's why what he did was stronger. He showed you don't have to scream to win. Sometimes calm cuts deeper." His daughter nodded slowly, the lesson sinking in. That same night in Los Angeles, a group of community organizers held a town hall. Instead of talking about their usual agenda, housing, local ordinances, crime, they opened the floor by playing Mamdani's words. The most powerful thing a leader can say is not "sit down," it's "stand up with me." A woman in the back stood and said, "That's what we need in this neighborhood. Leaders who invite us in, not push us out." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, the organizers left feeling unified around something larger than policy. At the same time, in a suburban library in Wisconsin, a book club turned into an impromptu debate about the moment. One retiree shook her head and said, "I don't agree with all of Mamdani's politics, but my goodness, he showed restraint. That's character." Across from her, another member sighed, "Bolsonaro was elected because he fights. Some people like that toughness." A third voice cut in gently, "But fighting isn't the same as leading. That's what Mamdani showed us." The conversation didn't end with agreement, but it ended with thoughtfulness. And that was rare enough to matter. By Friday, even schools that rarely touch politics were embracing the lesson. In a fifth-grade classroom in Sao Paulo, students were asked to write about what leadership meant to them. One child's essay, shared by the teacher online, read simply, "Leaders don't make people feel small, they make people feel tall." The post went viral, proof that even children had understood the heart of the moment. Meanwhile, Mamdani's silence after the forum became part of the story itself. He didn't tour the networks, he didn't send tweets. He let the words he had already spoken do the work. That restraint was as much a lesson as the reply itself. By contrast, Bolsonaro doubled down, interviews, tweets, statements, all brimming with defiance. His supporters rallied, but even many of them admitted privately that the exchange had left a mark. Historians began weighing in too. One wrote in The Atlantic, "Moments like these are less about the immediate politics and more about the cultural memory they create. A decade from now, students will read about this clash, not for what it did to Bolsonaro or Mamdani politically, but for what it said about Brazil's struggle with respect and leadership." In churches, classrooms, workplaces, and homes, the words had taken on a life of their own. Mamdani's response was no longer about him. It was about anyone who had ever been told to sit down, to be quiet, to accept disrespect. It was about the choice to answer, not with rage, but with dignity. That perhaps was the lesson Brazil couldn't ignore. Leadership isn't about how loudly you command. It isn't about belittling others to prove your strength. True leadership is measured by restraint, by patience, by the ability to remind others of their worth without shouting them down. And in that Sao Paulo hall, in front of cameras, crowds, and millions of screens, Mamdani had reminded the nation of something timeless. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. For viewers, for citizens, for anyone watching from afar, the story wasn't just about two men on a stage with microphones. It was about us, about what kind of example we want for our children and what kind of leaders we choose to follow. So if you take anything from that moment, let it be this: words matter. How you respond to disrespect matters even more. And when the world tells you to sit down, the real strength might just be in inviting others to stand up with you. Thank you for watching this story. If it resonated with you, if it made you think about leadership, dignity, or the kind of example you want to set, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories to come, stories that matter, stories that remind us who we are and who we can be.